Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning. Okay, let me get set up here. So I know that this will come as news to everybody that this past Thursday was Thanksgiving. Not sure if that hit your radar. So I have a message and I have a handout. They're not necessarily covering at all the same material. They'll really give you this. You can check to see that folks have one that would be pretty fabulously helpful. So maybe some of you share this because there are a few things that bother me about the calendar, and one of them is just how easily the calendar of Thanksgiving gets skipped over. Have you ever noticed that? It's like Thanksgiving is merely the segue that people have to go through so that they can eat enough to make it to Black Friday. And now we have Cyber Monday, and maybe a few other things too. Have you noticed this? I feel like you can get you can buy like a Christmas tree. I think it's like August it's right? It's like, I love Christmas, don't get me wrong. But first off, largely what is being promoted out there has nothing to do with why Christmas actually exists in the first place, right? So I like evergreen trees, but I can walk by and growing, There's still leaves on the regular trees in August, there's the Christmas tree trees put up in rows and wherever else. Thanksgiving just gets skipped over. How do you know it? You know it's Thanksgiving not by walking through the mall, but by walking through the supermarket, right? Because all the turkeys are. Now, I'm not quite sure why, but when people see me walking around, they say the same thing. I'm not sure if it's related to where the turkeys are out now. I'm not really sure if it means the same thing, but it gets kind of confusing. So, I did a little research just to find out what is going on here, because Thanksgiving is awesome. We as a society have ridiculous amounts of stuff. This was literally highlighting that I didn't know this before. When not too far from my house, storage lockers were put in. Think about it. We have so much stuff, we design our homes keeping it in mind, right? We have basics to store that stuff. Make straps of wood, but anyway. Now, and then we make sure to put in the attics so we can store more stuff. And if you don't have an attic, you make friends with somebody who does, right? And then you build a garage so you can store that stuff. And then you're going to rent a storage locker. To get in, okay? It's easier to get in to see the dental hygienist than it is to probably get a storage locker nowadays. And that's saying something because it takes a long time to get in to see those folks. We have stuff everywhere. The reality is that even as expensive as things like gas are, and gas is getting ridiculously expensive, the reality is that when we're told we can afford to pay for it, the reality is, in many ways, I'm not saying you'd like to, I'm not saying you should have to. But the reality is, prices go up. We still fundamentally live much the same, right? Certain things might be more difficult. You might not be able to save as much. And I'm not trying to say that maybe there's certain persons who delay making or don't make it all. But fundamentally, our standard of living would be the envy of massive portions of the world right now. And the question is how thankful are we? We have a day set aside for giving thanks. And with the amount of stuff we have, I would have to worry that anything's going to happen. I can go to whatever church I wanted to. No issue. That's amazing. I could walk up to any political leader in this country and tell them I think they're a moron. You know what's going to happen to me? Some people are going to clap, and some people are going to boo, and that's it. Have you ever thought about that? Not that I'm a big fan of the world of Facebook, shock to a lot of people. But I don't really do much anything on Facebook. I thought that was one of those books you opened in the year. You know, but I mean, the comments in the world of Facebook can get another life. Notice that? It's amazing because you can respond that way to a public official. Have any of you ever had a knock at your door by the local police department because of something you posted on Facebook or Twitter or any other place? And we have that issue. But think about it, right? When's the last time you knew somebody that disappeared because they said something against the government? I mean, the freedoms that we enjoy and the material benefits that we enjoy are absolutely amazing. So, thinking about that, okay, thanks. Now, we know the basic narrative, right? When we talk about, when we think about Thanksgiving, in the American psyche, where does your mind go? Pilgrims, right? 1621, Plymouth Colony. So who's there? Different place. Who's there? They did. But so we have 1621. We're in Plymouth. Who's there? Okay, so Squanto's there. William Bradford's going to be there. Who's Squanto? Who's Squanto? Okay, so he's a Native American that's going to help out the Pilgrims because the Pilgrims were well acquainted with living in Europe. North America, not so much. So now we have William Bradford. Now who's William Bradford? Okay, so he is the present governor. Their initial governor went kaput. William Bradford is going to be their governor for like 30-something years. Who else is there? Elder Brewster? Yes. So Brewster is an elder in their congregation. Their actual lead pastor stayed back in England because not all of them could make the journey. So they sent one of the elders of the church to be their pastor until all of them could eventually come over. Miles Standish is there. Security detail. I didn't know that. See, now I do. Wow. I wonder if that's still the case. I'm not sure. Anybody else? Okay, let's even talk about groups, right? We have pilgrims. Now, we use this as like one kind of catch-all term. We have pilgrims. What's a pilgrim?
Traveler.
Okay, so we know that they're traveling. Okay? Dig a little deeper. Who are these people?
One group were called strangers because they were not like the separatists, like the Christian component of the group. So you had Christian and separatists, and you had the strangers.
Okay, wonderful. So let's start with the strangers.
And then you have security detail and Miles Standish.
So we have strangers. Now, believe it or not, of the original 102 or 4, I'm great with numbers, trust me.
I think it was 102.
Did you know the majority of them are actually strangers? Of the group that we think of as pilgrims, a lot of the original ones that came over, the separatists were actually a minority. Well, why are those the ones we think of? Because they were a single cohesive group. Does that make sense? So they were a single cohesive group. Whereas everybody else that had joined in because they thought, hey, going to North America sounds good. I would like to leave England. And they helped pay for the journey because you couldn't charter a ship for free. So they helped provide some of the finances. The separatists had left England, gone to Holland, and then come back to England to make the journey. But most of their property had already been confiscated by the good king of England at the time period. That's why he left.
Now, if you like irony of all ironies, the good king of England that did all of these wonderful magical deeds for the separatists was none other than King James I. Yeah, same dude, actually. Same person who is instrumental in having the scholars develop the King James Version of the Bible. Also not real popular among the Pilgrims. That's why they used a different translation of the Bible. They did not use the King James Version of the Bible. They would have not been very happy about that. So that's who these people are. Now, what makes them distinct? Doctrinally, they were Puritans, more or less. They had one major difference between the Puritans that settled Massachusetts Bay, Boston being the most prominent settlement, but there were others, actually before Boston. But don't tell the people of Boston that. And the separatists, they're going to hit Plymouth. By the way, did you know that Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth and Massachusetts were actually two separate colonies until about the 1690s? It took a long time for the two to be viewed as the same thing. Two completely different charters, but that's beside the point. Because the point here is that doctrinally, one believed in the unification of churches, and the other ones did not. The separatists wanted nothing to do with the Church of England, and they believed that the two things should be held distinct. The Puritans didn't inherently have a problem with the church-state relationship in England. They just thought that the Church of England was problematic. Hence the name Puritan. They wanted to purify the church. They wanted to purify the conduct. But they didn't actually dislike the claim. They also didn't have a lot of doctrinal differences with the Church of England. Some, but not a ton. So here's our group of people. An interesting group of people. A much more diverse group of people than you might be thinking. So we know that the Pilgrims were there, but the Pilgrims are composed of strangers and they're composed of separatists. They've been there for about a year. Who else is there? Okay, who's he?
The chief of indigenous persons.
Yep, he is a Wampanoag chief. The Wampanoag tribe, who is largely the reason why the colony at Plymouth is going to succeed. Had they decided to become hostile, let's face it, people that are dying on a weekly basis, that are too weak to do much more than move to do basic functions, are probably not going to give you a stiff defense. So they join in. Now, this narrative is under increasing, you could say attack, you could say increasing pushback. Not because what I said is incorrect, but because, quite frankly, the roots of Thanksgiving are, at least in some circles, no longer celebrated. There is a certain sense in which Thanksgiving is being viewed similar to how Columbus Day is viewed, a tragedy for the native population. As a matter of fact, since 1970, and actually there is a plaque on Coles Hill in Plymouth talking about the National Day of Mourning for Native Americans, basically beginning the European influx coming into North America and the tragedy that existed then and thereafter for native populations. They have every year they march through Plymouth, Massachusetts, as a silent protest to what Thanksgiving is. And they believe they've done this since 1970. Now, for years and years and years, I'm willing to bet most people have no idea this happened. This year, I don't even think last year, this year, it finally made news headlines. Now, I'm not here to run a large historiographic lesson on the roots of Thanksgiving, who all the personalities are, and everything that's happened. So you might wonder if you should just do that. No, we barely scratched the surface. We didn't even get into any primary source material. But I'm bringing this up because That's usually our popular consciousness of what it goes to when we think about Thanksgiving. There's nothing wrong with that. As a matter of fact, we need to keep some of those things. For instance, there are some incredibly powerful narratives that come out of that view of Thanksgiving that doesn't view it as tragic, but it views it as something absolutely beautiful that would come out in a history class. There's actually some incredibly powerful symbols and ideas that come out of that I think if people actually sat and thought for a while, they would say, this is something we need to preserve. But I'm not sure how loud that voice is being put out in the public square. That's not my project. Because modern Thanksgiving uses that as a very, very powerful symbol, but it's actually not directly related to that first Thanksgiving at all. As a matter of fact, the same exact group of people that we're talking about, the Pilgrims don't necessarily have a yearly Thanksgiving celebration. They don't have it every single year. Thanksgiving did develop during the colonial period of the United States. It was predominantly in, guess what section of the country? Largely New England. Thanksgiving was very much a New England thing. Not that none of the other colonies ever did, but a lot of it was in New England. And it was kind of sporadic. Now, the roots of Thanksgiving for the United States of America, the first Thanksgiving officially sanctioned in the United States came in 1777. In 1777, the Continental Congress passed an action endorsed by the President of the Continental Congress, Henry Lawrence, calling for a national day of Thanksgiving for the result of the Battle of Saratoga. The victory, the Patriot victory at Saratoga, we usually talk about that as a turning point in the war. It helps to convince France to come in and join the cause. It was a national day of Thanksgiving. Now, I've given you something, and one of the things that is available there's a link that you'll have to type in, or if you want the electronic version, I can send you the electronic version, and you can just click on it, which is a lot easier. We'll send you to the complete text of that document. I've given you just a little bit of a summary to give you an idea, hopefully to make you curious. But here's the thing. If you read that document, it is unmistakably based in biblical Christianity. Unmistakably. Now, the Continental Congress won't necessarily have one every single year. The next major time that you're going to see Thanksgiving hit the American national consciousness is going to be by George Washington. George Washington in 1789 is going to issue a proclamation. He's going to be instructed to do so by the United States Congress. The United States Congress is going to say, issue this as a day of Thanksgiving for the implementation of the United States Constitution. And again, there's a link to that complete text, and I would encourage you to take a look at it. Because there can be little doubt that it is based in a Judeo-Christian framework. If you keep on going, I gave you a link to a letter written from Thomas Jefferson to Levi Lincoln. I believe this was actually during Jefferson's presidency. To Levi Lincoln, who Levi Lincoln served in his cabinet. He was from New England. Correspondence, because Thomas Jefferson, unlike his predecessors and unlike actually his successor, James Madison, issues no public call for Thanksgiving or fasting, because he viewed it as a religious action, and it shouldn't happen under a government with the First Amendment. Belying the fact that Thanksgiving had a very strong connection to the Judeo-Christian, the biblical framework of understanding who you're giving thanks to. Now, modern Thanksgiving usually traces its roots back to none other than Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln is going to receive a letter from a lady advocating for Thanksgiving. She's a New Englander. She grew up in the tradition of New England Thanksgivings. And it is going to be her action ultimately that Abraham Lincoln will undertake and issue a proclamation of Thanksgiving, specifically coming after the battle at Gettysburg. Interestingly enough, he issues his proclamation the same date, just separated by a number of years, as George Washington issues his. They're both issued on October 3rd. And no, I don't think that just happened by random chance. If you know anything about Abraham Lincoln has a flair for the dramatic connection. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth. Abraham Lincoln knew exactly what he was doing. And again, we hear about the divine benefactor that's being thanked. It's not going to be an official act, but Thanksgiving will be celebrated up through. We're going to have a brief period where President Franklin Delano Roosevelt is going to try to change the date. He's going to try to move the date of Thanksgiving back a week. Tried to make it a week earlier. Instead of the last Thursday, it was going to be the second to last Thursday. Because that way, the shopping season for Christmas started earlier, and he was trying to help pull us out of the Great Depression. A lot of people didn't really feel like, some stores didn't feel like changing their promos. A number of states didn't follow suit, and it got really confusing to have two Thanksgivings. So in 1941, Franklin Delano Roosevelt formally declared the last Thursday of November as the official holiday for U.S. Thanksgiving. And it has not been challenged or changed ever since. So why do I share this? Number one, if you're worried that Thanksgiving is being overshadowed and too commercialized by Christmas, apparently they had the same problem in 1939. You know, the good old days, they listen to all the songs about when you think, Christmas was pure, we didn't have this commercialization back then. 1939 is calling, and apparently they did. But also with this, I know I said this before, but if you're going to have Thanksgiving, you need someone to thank. I mean, if you're just giving thanks, thank you to who? Maybe you've done it to your parents, or maybe you remember when you were a little kid. Have you ever instructed anyone to, or been told to, say thank you for something? You ever see that happen, right? Somebody gives like a small child something and mom or dad are standing there. Now say thank you to them. Have you ever seen this scene? Right? Have you ever been around that same group of people, a child and a parent, and the child finds like maybe $1 laying on the sidewalk? And the child picks it up. Have you ever heard the same parents tell the child, now say thank you for that? Have you ever seen that? If you find $1 laying on the sidewalk, have you ever been tempted to say thank you? To who? I mean, there's no person for you to thank, right? Chances are the person who's responsible for it ultimately ending up there, rather than being thanked, would like the $1 back. Right? There's a massive difference, though. We may say thank you to God, but we know full well we're not going to go find a person to thank. If you find $1 in the parking lot, at Stewart's or something like that, you're going to go inside and thank the store clerk for having that $1 there for you? Probably not. Thanksgiving needs someone to thank. There has to be someone to thank if you're going to say thank you. If you just randomly walked around outside saying thank you, people would think you're senile. And here's what's great. In the documentation setting up Thanksgiving as a national entity in the United States, as a national holiday, its connection to God is unmistakable. Every single one, whether it's Continental Congress, whether it's George Washington, or whether it's Abraham Lincoln, all of them contain references to, at the very least, the divine benefactor, the creator. Some of them specifically mention Jesus Christ. It was actually a strong enough connection between the celebration of Thanksgiving and God that Thomas Jefferson uses that as his reason for never declaring a national day of Thanksgiving during his presidency. Now, some people are going to hear this, and maybe they'll just choose to turn it into a crusade to get rid of Thanksgiving because it's some sort of relic of, misogynist, biblically enforced America. My project is very, very different. My project is simply this. Whatever the nation chooses to do, I can't control. I can't even really impact it. But I'm much more concerned about what the church chooses to do. Because here's the thing. Thanksgiving is established as a holiday, nationally speaking, by an action of the United States government. What if the United States government decides it no longer wants to commemorate Thanksgiving Day? What will we do? Are we going to stop giving things? I mean, think about it. And I'm not trying to, say that this is what's going to happen, but how will we respond? Where is our biblical pattern going to be? Because of all the places that should be super, super excited about Thanksgiving, I think the church should be number one. We know exactly who we're thanking for the benefits and blessings that we enjoy. We know exactly who has carried us through the difficulties. One of the things that's interesting about Thanksgiving is that they're commonly declared after some great thing has happened, maybe a great victory, after a time period of severe trial. If you know anything about the American Revolution prior to Saratoga, let's just say that the U.S. wasn't doing so hot. If you know anything about the Civil War up until Gettysburg, the Civil War was not exactly going the Union's direction. So I started thinking here. Thanksgiving is a word specifically used in the Old Testament. And certainly we're to be a thankful people. What can we look at? Because that's what the United States has done. And that's valuable for us to understand as Christians in the United States, as citizens, as people, as believers. But I'm much more interested in what the biblical record bears out. So there's a few places we're going to go to. One of them is going to be Leviticus. We're going to hop into Psalms for a little bit, and ultimately we'll end up in Nehemiah. So hopefully your fingers aren't too cold, and you can still flip pages. So the first place we're going to go is Leviticus chapter 7, which is where all good Thanksgiving sermons begin. Now, in Leviticus 7, specifically looking at verses 12 through 15, we're going to see that within the peace offering, so one of the major sacrifices of Israel is the peace offering. The peace offering is a voluntary offering that a person could bring, and there were certain specific reasons for doing so. There's a couple different types, and then each person that brought it would have their own particular motivation. So verse 11 introduces the law of the sacrifice of the peace offerings. The very first peace offering that God tells Israel they can bring is the offering of thanksgiving. You can see that there in verse 12. If he offers it for thanksgiving, then he shall offer. And notice that then the verse continues to talk about the specific items that should be brought. Now, I'm not going through necessarily all of the Mosaic sacrifices. I'm not concerned about exactly what they needed to bring. I will give you a hint. Turkey doesn't make the list, okay, folks? Okay? And neither does stuffing. I'm sorry. All right? So, verse 13 continues to clarify that. In verse 15, it says something very distinctive. It says, the flesh of the sacrifice of his peace offering for thanksgiving shall be eaten the same day it is offered. He shall not leave any of it until morning, which means this Thanksgiving also did not come with leftovers. Okay, what in the world is going on here? Well, Few things. Like I said, peace offerings were all voluntary, so the peace offering of thanksgiving was voluntary. Why would somebody bring it? They would bring it if there was a particular blessing that they wanted to show specific public thanks to God for. It was a public action. Does that make sense? Because you didn't do a peace offering for Thanksgiving, like, I don't know, in like your closet. You didn't even do it in your own kitchen. In order to do it, you had to bring it to the tabernacle. Everybody knew. And you say, wow, that's a very public action to take. Is this showy? Is it showy to say that we're now expressing thanks to God because this benefit that I didn't earn or deserve, He has given and granted to me, and I want to publicly declare my thanks, so I'm going to bring an offering. Because here's the second thing I don't want to get into. Not only was it public, it was costly. I mean, there's a list of things you have to bring. And you're going to leave some of that with the priest, and some of it you're going to take home with you, and you can't save any of it. Which means you have a lot of food on your hands. How do you get rid of a lot of food? You eat. How much are you going to eat? You can't save it. So, how do you make sure that you have no leftovers? Invite people over. Which means that this was also an occasion to gather. This was an occasion to share. In the ancient world, especially at the time period that this is being written, Israel is going to be a herding nation. Not herding, herd in, right? They're going to have sheep and stuff like that. So this was your primary source of wealth. Some of you might remember in the book of Job, when it introduces Job, it talks about Job as being very wealthy. How does it display how wealthy Job is? Yeah, how big his flocks in his livestock were, his herds. It didn't tell you how big his IRA was. It didn't tell you about his real estate portfolio. It didn't talk about his money. It didn't talk about silver or gold. It talked to you about how many animals he had. So if you're bringing an offering, any kind of offering, but especially a voluntary offering, it is a true sacrifice because you are parting with some of your wealth. That's a big deal if you're a nation that is predominantly still taking care of livestock. It's a costly thing to give. Now, if we go over to Leviticus 22, specifically 29, it just says this: when you offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving to the Lord, offer it of your own free will. That is, this is to be unconstrained. Because here's the thing. And maybe you've seen this. My favorite example of this is actually telling the child to say sorry. You know, at what point is it not really a thanksgiving if somebody's forcing you to do it? How do you force thankfulness? And I'm not trying to pick on people who are trying to teach their children how to be thankful or how to apologize or how to accept an apology. But think about it. If you have to enforce thankfulness, or if you have to enforce forgiveness, is it really occurring? I think we have to ask that question. So God says, look, this offering of thanksgiving is something you have to choose to do yourself. If you don't want to do it, then who cares? It's just you burning part of an animal, giving some of it away, and having a big dinner. No question. If we're not choosing of our own free will to be thankful at all times of the year, but hopefully, especially at least on a holiday specifically set aside for it, then all you're doing is eating a whole bunch of food and getting some leftovers. And maybe watching a football game. There's nothing wrong with any of those things. But it's not Thanksgiving. It's not being thankful. Now, a couple of places I want to go in the Psalms. Specifically, I'm not going to go to every single one of these, but if you want to read in the Psalms about Thanksgiving, a great place to go to, two of them in particular, Psalm 95 and Psalm 100. Both of them express the theme of thankfulness and thanksgiving beautifully. I want to go to Psalm 107, verse 22. So in Psalm 107, verse 22, it says, "Let them sacrifice the sacrifices of thanksgiving and declare his works with rejoicing." And that's one of the things you're going to find if you hit Psalm 95 and Psalm 100, is this idea of rejoicing. That is, this wasn't like we're being thankful. Boy, are we thankful today. This is not an Eeyore Thanksgiving. That is, this was supposed to be a time of celebration. So now that we were gathered, not only was it public, not only was it costly, but this was something that was supposed to be a time of happiness and joy. You're excited to do this. You are willingly choosing to do this. And I know we don't think of this today, but if you think about what Old Testament worship looked like, then the number one word that should probably come to mind was sacrifice. Sacrifices was actually the number one commanded thing to do for Israel's worship. They're listed all over the place. If you had Sabbath, many of them were doubled. If they came together and there was something that had to be celebrated, you know what was offered? Sacrifices. What happened when the temple was dedicated? Remember when Solomon dedicated the temple? What did they do? Sacrifices. A lot of them. Like somebody lost their herd. So for this to be a sacrifice, it might seem weird to us because this isn't obviously the system that we follow, but for Israel, that was a way that it could be commemorated, that this was truly an act of devotion to God. This would be an essential part of worship. So I just jotted down a few takeaways. Number one, when we talk about biblical thanksgiving, number one, it's sacrificial. It's going to cost you something. It's voluntary. It has to be done of your own free will. To be a gathering of thanksgiving, according to the Mosaic Law, there's no leftovers, not even for a day. By the way, that's distinct because there are others of the sacrifices of the peace offering that you're actually allowed to hold some over until the next day, some of them even for the day after that. Not Thanksgiving, all gone. There's a reason for that. It's celebratory. Specifically, you're supposed to be celebrating God's provision, His protection, and His plan, if you go down through all the passages. It's pointed. You have to be thankful to someone. And it's worshipful. It's time to remember how worthy God is of that worship and how worthy He is to be thanked. You know, saying thank you is pretty humbling, actually, if you think about it, isn't it? What does it take to say thank you? I mean, really say thank you and really be thankful. As opposed to say, oh, thanks. I mean, we can say thank you so easily. It's kind of like saying the words, how are you? Have you ever had somebody pass you and go, how are you? And they kept on walking? You couldn't have responded if you had to. You'd have to chase them down. Why are you following me? I'm telling you how I am. You asked. I mean, we would annoy literalists to no end. It's so easy. But how humbling is it to actually mean it? I mean, if we spent every single day thankful to God for everything He's done for us, how humble would we be underneath His care? It's really easy for us to say, God, thank you for today. Are we really thankful for today? I mean, I can do at least some interesting things. I can't give myself a day. Think about it. I can't give myself today. I don't control the movement of the heavenly bodies. I do absolutely nothing to keep the earth in its orbit. I will tell you that right now. I don't make sure that the earth spins. I have no control over that. I don't even regulate my own heart rate. My brain involuntarily does that for me. And you've got an awesome brain that allows you to both be voluntary and involuntary with your breathing. Isn't that cool, by the way? If you fall asleep, your breathing, it takes care of itself. Your brain goes, oh yeah, we got this on autopilot now. But if you want to, you can take over. It's really helpful for not drowning. But your heart rate, I have no ability to do that. Your body takes care of that completely independent of any conscious thought you've ever tried to put into it. The only way you can increase your heart rate is by trying to stress yourself out. Just not. I can't do anything to preserve my heart rate going through. That's all me. I have got as much control of my heart rate as I do of the earth. I can't do it. Thank you for this food. Huh, well, I cooked that. Wow, what an accomplishment. I'm the one that controls all the seasons to make sure that planting and harvesting can happen. I control all the animal instincts that make sure that they don't die. To make sure that diseases don't spread through to take out birds and flocks. Now, my great accomplishment, I watered the store. Do say thank you. But I can't think of a way to be thankful and proud. Pride wants to say, I did. Right? If you're proud, who are you thanking? Yeah. I'm so thankful that I'm so awesome to myself. I mean, if you articulate it that way, it kind of sounds foolish. Now, this is great, in its stuff. I wanted to see this kind of play out a little bit, and fortunately, there's at least one occasion where you can see it play out beautifully, and that's in the book of Nehemiah, chapter 12. Now, in Nehemiah chapter 12, we're going to use 27 through 30 and then verse 43. Not that the intervening pages are all that bad, but there's a lot of names that we're probably going to have a really, really hard time pronouncing, and it largely has to do with what sections of the choir went where. Now, we can read those, but I'd rather just have you read them independently. So, Nehemiah is an official actually underneath the king of Persia. We know he's a cupbearer. He's Jewish, and he's burdened because he hears that Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, capital of Judah specifically, the walls are broken, the place is in ruins, and things are not going well. His heart breaks. To make a long story short, he gets all kinds of letters of commendation to travel there and to rebuild the city walls of Jerusalem. Now, lest we lose any even imagination of just how remarkable this is, a city rebuilding its walls was commonly seen as a threat in the ancient world. So the idea that a king was going to allow this guy to go back and rebuild city walls, please don't let that miracle escape your consciousness ever. Because city walls is what kept the enemy out and you safe inside. The only way to take a good walled city was siege. Sieges were a good way to not succeed, lose supply lines, and die. Oh yeah, it was terrible for the inside population, but siege warfare in the ancient world was not fabulously successful. Laying siege to a walled city was what we call, in modern English, stupid. It was hard to keep a good siege, especially if you had a city that was well set up to withstand a siege. I know a good city that's well set up to withstand a siege. You want to know what it is? Jerusalem. God allowed certain provisions to happen specifically to withstand sieges. As a matter of fact, if you go back through and you look at your Old Testament history, Jerusalem withstood siege after siege after siege. I can give you a group of people that successfully took Jerusalem by siege. The Romans. It took them over a year. It took them a huge army. And it was one of the major accomplishments of the year for the Roman Empire to take the city of Jerusalem by siege. It was so devastating, the Roman army went so crazy that they literally tore the temple to pieces and burned it so badly, they melted the gold between the cracks of the rocks, and that's why they had to disassemble it to get at it. They weren't supposed to set the temple on fire, but the armies were so resentful that they did anyways. Taking Jerusalem by siege, horrible experience. Nehemiah walks in with letters from the king of Persia. The king of Persia says, I can rebuild the walls. Boy, this king better have a good idea of who he just told can rebuild the walls. Because you could just allow a group of people within your borders to build a rebellion at the same time. We got our nice walls back. Bring it on, king. But the problem is that without walls, your settlement is wide open to any armed band that wants to come through and pillage and steal. If you don't have city walls, you are done for. In Jerusalem at this time is, relatively speaking, depopulated. And you know the story, right? They go through, they rebuild the walls, they do it really, really well. They're building with one hand, they have a sword in the other hand. Basically, they have to be ready to build and defend themselves at a minute's notice. You thought Minutemen were a New England invention. Nehemiah had Minutemen way back then. Sorry, Thanksgiving reference, New England, I just had to. But, so that they do this, and there's a tremendous amount of reform. At the same time, Ezra is doing things in the temple. This is a time of reform and rebuilding in Israel, and finally, it's done. Finally, all of the obstacles, whether they're building pressures, whether they're people, whether they're all these things, have been overcome, and in Nehemiah 12, they're going to dedicate the wall. Now, at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought out the Levites in all their places to bring them to Jerusalem to celebrate the dedication with gladness, both with thanksgivings and singing, with cymbals and stringed instruments and harps. And the sons of the singers gathered together from the countryside around Jerusalem, from the villages of the, oh boy, here we go, Netophathites, from the house of Gilgal, from the fields of Geba and Azmaveth. For the singers had built themselves villages all around Jerusalem. Then the priests and the Levites purified themselves, purified the people, the gates, and the wall. They're getting ready to celebrate with thanksgivings. Now, specifically, this would mean that what sacrifices would be offered? Specifically, you'd expect to have Thanksgiving sacrifices offered, although there would be other sacrifices that would attend this as well. Now, the next several verses talk about how he brought them up and how he arranged the leaders of Israel and how he had the choirs move and stuff like that. So I hate to say it, but I did skip it in no small part because a lot of the names would be a lot of fun to read. And I don't have a great mental image for choir direction, I have to admit. Verse 43 says this though. Also that day they offered great sacrifices and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. The women and the children also rejoiced, so that the joy of Jerusalem was heard afar off. Now, here's what I found fascinating. Israel is celebrating a Thanksgiving. And boy, is it pointed, isn't it? What specifically are they having this great Thanksgiving for? The walls are finished. The walls are being dedicated. There are very few symbols of protection in the ancient world more powerful than a walled city. Read the book of Proverbs. Solomon talks about it. For Israel, the walls being erected again was one of the best symbols they could have of God's provision and specifically His protection. Those walls allowed the population to dwell securely. How many blessings are more precious to us than the knowledge that ourselves and our loved ones can live in a relatively peaceful and safe setting? What would you be willing to do to make sure that that was the case? How thankful would you be once that situation is achieved? That's the occasion that Israel is celebrating. They say, wow, God, you allowed us to rebuild our walls. Something very improbable during foreign occupation against tremendous odds and obstacles. But God, you brought us through this. And we are thankful to you for allowing us the safety and security the walls provide. So I'm not trying to say that there's anything wrong with a yearly celebration of Thanksgiving. But I want to challenge us with this. For Thanksgiving, have something specific in mind. We can be very, very general, and sometimes when we're very, very general, we kind of lose a poignancy that comes with having something specific we're thankful for. Some new thing that happened, or some specific thing that we are so thankful God has allowed to be in our lives and allowed us to enjoy. That pointedness allows us to escape the, dear Heavenly Father, thank you for stuff and things. Right? Kind of loses its potency when that's what it sounds like. You know, if you thank somebody for something and you says, hey, thanks for the stuff and things. Huh? I mean, fortunately, God can read your mind, so I guess He at least can fill in the blanks. But, I mean, you're kind of being nebulous. How different is it if you can go to God and say, boy, Lord, this year I had no idea how I was going to be able to afford safe transportation so I could take my family back and forth to school and get to work. You provided it. Thank you. Specific. I think it also keeps ourselves in good check here. Israel got it. They were having this Thanksgiving for a specific thing. By the way, even in U.S. history, we got it. We passed resolutions of Thanksgiving after specific major changes that God brought about that allowed our national survival. We got it. The question is, as a church, will we recover that and will we keep it? Be pointed. Don't be general. Okay? General responses, I send them back to students and they tell me to give me particulars and details, right? Don't give me generalities. I need specifics. Is it because I don't know anything? No, it's because I want them to learn to do it. Sometimes I think that's what God wants us to do. Be thankful to me for something specific. You'll learn more that way. I also see it as celebratory. This is a celebration. There's Thanksgiving and singing. There's symbols. Not symbols like the symbol for ant, like symbols as in stringed instruments. This was not a, boy, are we thankful today, God, you gave us this. I mean, this was, I don't want to call it a party, but this was a pretty joyful thing that they were doing. This was not a somber occasion. But just make sure it's also organized. If all of the verses we didn't read about Nehemiah giving directions to the choir, it's very organized. It is a time period of rejoicing, but it is not chaos. Make sure I throw that in there. But here's my favorite part. Did you catch it in verse 43 at the very, very end? So that the joy of Jerusalem was heard afar off. Have you ever been like going by like maybe a sports stadium or something? I use sports because that's about one of the only things that we get loud about, okay? I think it's actually kind of sad, right? God can do tremendous things in our lives and we're like, yay, thanks God. Right? Our team scores a touchdown and we jump up and down. Reverse. We're told that at this celebration of Thanksgiving, Jerusalem could be heard afar off, or heard at a distance. Have you been ever just like walking around and you can hear the tumult of the crowd, even though you're nowhere near the place? How loud does it have to be? I mean, how crazy would it be to be a mile or so, 2 miles outside of Jerusalem, and to be able to hear the sound of their celebration as they gave thanks to God? I find that kind of crazy. I also find it kind of cool. There are very few things that can move people more than sound. That's why we love music. I also see it as communal. If you notice that they actually brought in all the Levites and singers, and they actually like built little villages around Jerusalem as they came in from the countryside. This was a gathering of people. We saw this with the sacrifices as well. And I think that that's a great lesson for us as well. I mean, we think about it. We do this at our own Thanksgiving. It's one of the reasons why when people talk about celebrating Thanksgiving, don't do this and don't do that and go over here and don't go there and everything else and you can't go here and travel restrictions. You notice that Americans inherently kind of rebelled against that? There's something beautiful being able to gather and communally express thanks to God for what He has done. And then finally, it's worshipful. If you notice, the sacrifices were offered. You see the Levites being assembled. They're going to be singing. I don't think they're singing Deck the Halls. In last here, when we look at that, in verse 30, we see that the priests and the Levites purified themselves, the people, the gates, and the wall. This would have been performing the Mosaic purification rituals that would be done. A lot of it would be washing, symbolizing. So the outward washing would be symbolic of the inner washing that only God can do to the human heart. The inner purification that is the work of God. We tend to think of baptism as something that the church does. The church didn't invent baptism. The Jewish people had been doing baptism for centuries beforehand. As they've excavated more areas of the Temple Mount, they have found hundreds of areas for baptisms to occur. Because you couldn't go into the temple until you were ritually clean. How would you become ritually clean? You had to wash. So they had them carved out all over the place so that as travelers would come up to the Temple Mount, they could wash so that they would be ceremonially clean to go into the temple. Is it because God wanted to make sure that you were wet? No. It's because the outward action revealed, at least it was supposed to reveal, an inner changing, the inner working that God does. It's fundamentally an act of worship. Because by doing that, you're admitting you need purity, which means you don't already have it. And is there anything that's more worshipful than going to the God that made you and the one that sent His Son to pay for all of our wrong? To say, God, I'm not perfect. I need you. Worship has the idea of assigning weight and worth to. Is there anything we can do that shows God His worth and His weight more than to obey Him and to acknowledge our desperate need for Him? So as a church, not just here, just in general, as the church, no matter what happens, no matter how the narrative and the storyline about Thanksgiving may change, no matter who you hear is doing this, that, or the other thing, whether people seem for it or against it, no matter if you follow the Pilgrim storyline or whether you want to go to Continental Congress or Abraham Lincoln or anywhere in between, I hope that we remember that as Christians, we have so much to be thankful for, and we have someone amazing to be thankful to. Amen. And let it out. I mean, show people that you're thankful. Not by telling them how thankful you are, but I find that I can say one thing and I can communicate something else by sometimes the way my face looks and stuff like that. Do we seem thankful? I'm thankful to God for this. Are you really? Are you genuinely excited about Thanksgiving and showing thanks to God? It's been a good lesson for me. Because sometimes it's easier to think about the things we wish we had than to remember to be thankful for all the things that and the blessings that He has given to us. And what sells thankfulness more than pie? I mean, it's like the perfect food. No, in all seriousness, God has given us so much. I mean, things that we forget about because we've already moved on to the next thing. And we're thankful for that one, but we didn't even go back to the first one. It's constant. And unfortunately, I think a lot of times we only notice when it's quote unquote not there. Oh, yeah. God does provide that. My favorite analogy is my car. I take it for granted my car will start. To my embarrassment, I probably very rarely, if ever, say thank you, Lord, for allowing my car to start. Most of you would be like, wasn't it supposed to? How many things are supposed to happen that don't, folks? How thankful am I? Now that I've said that, I'm not going to start my car, jump out of my car, and jump up and down and go, woohoo, and then get back in my car, okay? I'm not going to do that. It is a celebration, but, you got to kind of temper things a little bit. But how thankful are we? And how much do we show it? Remember, you can't be forced. You have to choose to do it. Heavenly Father, thank you for today. Just thank you for your goodness and provision to us here. Lord, help us to be a thankful people. We will be thankful if you help us to be more thankful, as it will change so many things about how we view you and our relationship that we have with you. Help us to always lean back on your goodness to us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Motion.